In 1912, a railway crew was blasting through a Maryland mountainside, clearing rock for a new rail line, when the explosion tore open something nobody expected. A hidden cave, packed with bone. Over 40 species, more than a quarter of them extinct. A cave bear and a saber-toothed cat still stand on permanent display at the Smithsonian today. For decades, researchers guessed this deposit was roughly 200,000 years old. Then modern dating technology proved it was more than 3 times that age. What that number actually means for the story of Ice Age America is still being worked out over a century later. In October of 1912, a construction crew working for the Western Maryland Railway was cutting a path directly through the flank of Wills Mountain near the town of Cumberland in western Maryland. Their job had nothing to do with history and nothing to do with science. They were blasting loose limestone, clearing a straight, workable bed of rock that a rail line could eventually be laid across. This was ordinary industrial labor, the kind of project happening at dozens of sites across the growing American railway network at that exact moment. Nobody on that crew was looking for anything except a clear path forward. And that is worth sitting with for a moment, because what they actually broke open that October was not simply more rock to haul away. Buried inside the mountain, sealed behind solid limestone that had likely stood undisturbed for longer than anyone standing there could have possibly imagined, was a chamber. And that chamber was packed, wall to wall, with bone. A local naturalist named Raymond Armbruster happened to be in the area, and as the blasted rock settled, he noticed something the work crew had almost certainly walked straight past without a second glance. Fossilized bone scattered directly among the freshly broken limestone. To an ordinary observer, it might have looked like nothing more than unusual debris, easy to dismiss and easy to bury under the next load of rubble cleared from the cut. Armbruster did not dismiss it. He recognized it immediately as something worth reporting, rather than something to simply clear away and forget. Think about how easily this entire discovery could have vanished before anyone outside that mountainside ever knew it existed. If Armbruster had not happened to be standing there that particular week, if he had not recognized fossil bone for what it actually was, this cave and everything sealed inside it could have been shoveled into a railbed and buried under gravel and steel, permanently, without a single scientist ever laying eyes on it. Instead, Armbruster alerted scientists directly at the Smithsonian Institution, understanding that whatever had just been exposed inside that mountain deserved genuine expert attention rather than local guesswork. And the Smithsonian moved with real urgency. Within weeks of that first report, James Gidley, the museum's assistant curator of fossil mammals, was personally dispatched out to Maryland to investigate the find directly, in person, rather than relying on a secondhand description from someone without formal training in paleontology. Gidley's preliminary examination that October produced results serious enough, promising enough, that a full excavation of the site began before the year itself was even finished. Consider what that pace actually tells you about what Gidley found the moment he first stepped into that exposed chamber. This was not a cautious scientist filing a report for someone else to eventually follow up on at some distant future date. This was a curator who looked at what had come out of that Maryland mountainside and immediately understood that serious, sustained excavation needed to begin right away, before the site could be disturbed any further by the ongoing railway construction happening directly around it. By the time that first excavation season wrapped up, Gidley and his team had already begun pulling an extraordinary range of material out of the mountain, more than enough to establish that this was not some minor, isolated find, worth a brief mention in an annual report and nothing more. This was something considerably larger, a genuinely significant deposit of Pleistocene mammal remains, sitting in a region of the country where finds of this scale and preservation quality were at that time remarkably rare. And here is what makes the story of that very first excavation season so important to understand clearly before going any further. What Gidley's team began recovering in those initial weeks was not simply going to answer a few scientific questions and then quietly close the book on Cumberland Bone Cave for good. It was going to occupy the careers of multiple scientists, working across multiple decades, using scientific techniques that did not even exist yet in 1912. A rail crew looking for nothing more than a straight, workable path through solid rock had, entirely by accident, cracked open a scientific puzzle that would still be actively unfolding more than 100 years later, one that would eventually force researchers to reconsider almost everything they originally assumed about exactly how old the material buried inside that mountain actually was. Between 1912 and 1916 alone, in just the first few seasons of excavation, Gidley's team pulled remains representing more than 40 separate species of mammals out of that Maryland mountainside. 28 of those species, more than a quarter of the entire count, were already extinct, gone from the earth entirely, known to science only through exactly this kind of buried fossil record. Think about what that ratio actually means. This was not a scattering of a few unusual bones mixed in among ordinary, familiar wildlife. This was an assemblage where extinction itself was the dominant pattern, chamber after chamber holding the remains of animals that no longer exist anywhere on the planet. The showpiece of the entire collection turned out to be a distinct species of extinct cave bear, recovered in remains complete enough and significant enough that it was formally named directly for the site itself. A creature that once denned inside that same Maryland mountain, large and powerful enough to leave behind a skeleton scientists could study in real detail, now known specifically as the Cumberland cave bear because of exactly where it was found. Alongside that bear sat something even more striking to the ordinary imagination: the skeleton of an extinct saber-toothed cat, one of the true iconic predators of the Ice Age, the kind of animal most people only picture in museum dioramas or nature documentaries, recovered directly from this single Maryland cave. Both of these specimens, the cave bear and the saber-tooth, are not simply sitting forgotten in a storage drawer somewhere. They remain on permanent public display today in the Ice Age Mammal exhibit at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C., available for anyone to walk up and see in person, more than a century after they were first pulled out of that mountainside. But the two headline predators were genuinely only the beginning of what that cave actually contained. Beyond the cave bear and the saber-tooth, excavators recovered Mastodon remains, direct physical evidence that these massive Ice Age relatives of modern elephants once moved through this exact stretch of the Appalachian Mountains. They found the bones of extinct peccary species, pig-like animals that no longer exist anywhere in North America. They recovered coyotes and mountain lions, animals that, unlike the cave bear and the mastodon, still exist today. Their presence in the deposit offering a direct, tangible link between the Ice Age ecosystem preserved in that mountain and the wildlife still living in North America right now. And then there is the detail that stops most people cold the very first time they hear it. Among the recovered remains, excavators found the bones of a crocodile, an actual crocodile pulled directly out of a fossil deposit inside a Maryland mountain. By any modern standard, that animal has absolutely no business appearing in this specific fossil record at all. Crocodiles simply do not belong to the climate or the ecosystem most people associate with the Appalachian region, then or now, and its presence inside Cumberland Bone Cave remains one of the more genuinely puzzling details buried inside this entire deposit. Think carefully about what an assemblage this varied, this extreme in its range, actually tells you about the nature of this site. This was never simply one animal's grave, a single creature that wandered into the cave, died, and was left undisturbed. It was never the kind of narrow, single-event fossil deposit you sometimes find elsewhere, a flash flood or a single catastrophic collapse capturing one specific moment in time and sealing it away intact. What Gidley's team was actually looking at, spread across chamber after chamber inside that mountain, was something considerably stranger and considerably more valuable to science. A genuine accumulation, built up gradually across an enormous, almost incomprehensible span of time, inside a single hidden chamber that somehow kept collecting evidence of an entire changing ecosystem, layer upon layer, for far longer than anyone standing in that railway, cut in 1912, could have possibly guessed. And that raises the obvious next question, the one that would end up occupying scientists for the next 100 years, far more than any single species identification ever could. Exactly how old was this deposit really? Because the deeper researchers eventually dug into that specific question, using tools and techniques that simply did not exist back when Gidley first stepped into that mountain, the stranger, and the more genuinely significant the entire picture became. For most of the 20th century, researchers working with the Cumberland fauna placed its age at roughly 200,000 years old. That number sat largely unchallenged for decades, repeated in reports and publications, treated as a reasonably settled figure within the field. But here is what almost nobody outside the specialty understood about where that number actually came from. It was never based on directly dating the cave itself. No physical clock had ever actually been run on the deposit. Instead, researchers arrived at that figure indirectly by comparing which specific species were present in the Cumberland assemblage against other, better-studied fossil sites elsewhere in North America, sites that did have more reliable age controls attached to them. That method is not unreasonable on its face. Comparing known species across different sites is a legitimate, commonly used tool in paleontology, but it is fundamentally an indirect estimate, built on inference rather than direct physical measurement, and indirect estimates carry real uncertainty baked into them from the start, uncertainty that can sit quietly unnoticed for generations if nobody ever goes back and actually tests the assumption directly. That is precisely what finally happened, and relatively recently in the long history of this site. Researchers applied a combined dating method, uranium series analysis paired with electron spin resonance dating, directly to fossil material recovered from Cumberland Bone Cave. Specifically, they targeted fossil molars belonging to an extinct peccary species preserved within the deposit, teeth that had been sitting in museum collections for decades, waiting for a technology capable of reading their actual age directly, rather than estimating it by comparison. The results did not simply refine the existing 200,000-year figure, they shattered it. Two separate tooth samples, tested independently of one another, returned ages of roughly 722,000 years and 790,000 years, respectively. Let that number actually settle for a moment, because it deserves to. That is not a minor correction, the kind of small adjustment scientists make routinely as measurement techniques improve slightly over time. That is a fundamental reassessment, placing the true age of this fauna at more than 3 times older than the figure researchers had confidently worked with for the better part of a century. Think about what that scale of correction actually means for everyone who had studied this site across those preceding decades. Every paper written, every comparison drawn, every conclusion reached about how Cumberland fit into the broader picture of Ice Age North America. All of it had been built on top of a foundational number that turned out to be off by a margin of more than 500,000 years. Nobody had done anything wrong exactly. They had simply been working with the best indirect estimate available to them, at a time when no better, more direct method existed yet. This corrected age places the Cumberland fauna firmly within a specific geological interval that paleontologists call the Irvingtonian, a genuinely obscure window in North American Ice Age history, positioned well before the more famous, more thoroughly studied stretches of the Pleistocene that most people picture when they think of mammoths and saber-toothed cats and glaciers. The Irvingtonian remains, by comparison, poorly understood, and sites that can be reliably dated to fall squarely within it are genuinely rare across the entire eastern United States. That rarity is exactly why this correction matters so much more than a simple update to a museum placard somewhere. Cumberland Bone Cave was not just an old fossil site that turned out to be somewhat older than everyone assumed. It became, almost overnight, one of the most significant confirmed windows anywhere in eastern North America into a specific, poorly documented stretch of deep time that researchers had very few other reliable sites to study directly. And pushing the timeline back, that dramatically did something else entirely. Something that reaches well beyond simply adjusting a number on a chart somewhere in a research paper. It forced an entirely different, considerably harder question back into focus, one that had always been sitting quietly underneath the species list and the dating debate without ever being fully resolved. Exactly how did all of these bones, spanning such an enormous and newly understood stretch of time, actually end up sealed together inside a single chamber, deep inside a Maryland mountain, in the first place? Once researchers understood that Cumberland Bone Cave represented an enormous, previously unrecognized span of time, a much harder question moved to the center of the investigation. How does a crocodile end up buried alongside a saber-toothed cat, a mastodon, and dozens of other species, sealed together inside a single mountain chamber in western Maryland? The bones themselves could not answer that question directly. Understanding how they actually got there required a completely different kind of scientific reasoning, the careful, patient work of reconstructing not what the animals were, but how their remains actually arrived at that specific location and came to rest there together. The most obvious possibility, at least on the surface, was water. Could the bones have simply washed into the cave from somewhere outside, carried in gradually over time by streams or floodwater moving through the cave system, depositing material from a wider area into this one convenient chamber? It is a reasonable first hypothesis, and researchers examined it seriously rather than dismissing it out of hand. They rejected it. And it is worth understanding exactly why, because the reasoning itself tells you a great deal about how careful this kind of forensic paleontology actually has to be. Bones that wash into a cave through moving water tend to show specific, recognizable signs of that transport. They arrive jumbled, often broken and abraded by the physical process of tumbling through water and sediment, mixed together without any clear pattern connecting which bones belong near which other bones. That is simply not what researchers found when they examined the specific condition and positioning of the fossils recovered from Cumberland. The pattern did not match a washed-in assemblage at all. So if water was not the answer, what was actually happening inside that mountain across hundreds of thousands of years? The explanation researchers eventually built, drawn from multiple independent lines of physical evidence rather than a single convenient theory, points towards something considerably more ordinary, and in its own way, considerably more remarkable precisely because of how ordinary it actually was. Predators use this cave, repeatedly, across an almost incomprehensible span of time. Picture what that actually looked like in practice, played out across countless individual seasons. Owls roosting near the cave's entrance, doing exactly what owls have always done, coughing up compact pellets packed with the small, undigested bones of voles and other rodents they had hunted and consumed. Those pellets, dropped again and again in the same sheltered spot, accumulating steadily on the cave floor over time, contributing directly to the layered bone record researchers would eventually excavate. Alongside the owls, larger predators were doing something similar on a bigger scale entirely. Wolves and other carnivores using the deeper recesses of the cave as a den, a genuinely safe, sheltered place to raise young away from the exposed mountainside outside. And denning predators do not simply feed themselves quietly and leave no trace behind. They drag prey back to the den, feeding pups and juveniles on carcasses brought in from the surrounding landscape, leaving behind exactly the kind of scattered, broken skeletal remains that researchers would eventually find layered throughout the deposit, representing species from well beyond whatever small range immediately surrounded the cave entrance itself. Think about what that pattern actually means once you step back and look at the full scale of it. This was never one dramatic, singular event, a flood or a collapse or a mass trapping that captured an entire ecosystem all at once in a single frozen moment. It was something far more patient than that, and in some ways far stranger to fully comprehend. The ordinary, repeated behavior of generation after generation of predators, using that same sheltered mountain chamber as a den and a roost, century after century, for a stretch of time that dwarfs the entire span of recorded human history many times over without any real difficulty. Piecing that specific pattern together, distinguishing predator accumulation from water transport, tracing which layers held which species and in what condition, was not work that happened quickly or in a single triumphant discovery. It took decades of careful, methodical excavation and analysis, conducted by multiple research teams working across generations, each one adding another small piece to a picture that nobody standing inside that mountain in 1912 could have possibly imagined would take this long or require this much patient scientific effort to finally begin making real sense of. Between James Gidley's original 1912 excavation and the most recent fieldwork conducted a full century later, Cumberland Bone Cave was formally excavated 11 separate times by 5 entirely different institutions. Sit with that number for a moment because it says something important about the nature of this particular fossil site. This was never a case of one team arriving, quickly extracting everything of value, publishing a tidy summary, and moving on to the next discovery. This was a single deposit that quietly, steadily occupied the professional lives of multiple scientists working across multiple generations, using tools and techniques that evolved considerably over that same stretch of time. Gidley himself did not simply excavate the site once in 1912 and consider the job finished. He returned to Cumberland Bone Cave multiple times, in 1914 and again in 1915, each visit adding further species to the growing list, and several hundred more individual specimens to the Smithsonian's expanding fossil collection, and he did not stop working on the material even after the active fieldwork itself slowed down. Gidley remained personally engaged in a comprehensive study of the entire Cumberland fauna right up until his death in 1931, a project that, by the nature of his passing, was left genuinely incomplete, its full analysis unfinished at the moment he died. That unfinished work did not simply vanish along with him. The following year, Charles Gazin, newly appointed as the Smithsonian's assistant curator in the relevant division, picked up exactly where Gidley had been forced to leave off, carrying the project forward into its next phase. Think about what that continuity actually represents. A single fossil deposit significant enough that when one dedicated researcher's career ended, another scientist at the same institution felt the material was important enough to inherit and continue studying directly. Decades later, the site became central to an entirely different researcher's career altogether. John Gidley served as a curator at the Carnegie Museum of Natural History from 1951 until 1982, and across those 3 full decades, he returned to Cumberland Bone Cave again and again, leading field crews made up of both museum staff and dedicated volunteers back to the site repeatedly. Gidley's sustained, patient commitment to this single Maryland deposit, sustained across more than 30 years of an active scientific career, is exactly the kind of long-term investment that eventually made it possible for later researchers to apply modern dating technology to material that had, in some cases, been sitting carefully cataloged in museum collections for decades, simply waiting for the right technique to finally come along. Think carefully about what that actually means for how this story unfolded. This is not a discovery that happened once, generated a single burst of scientific publication, and then closed permanently as a settled matter. It is a single hidden chamber inside a Maryland mountain that quietly, steadily shaped the careers of multiple dedicated scientists across more than 100 years, each one adding another careful layer of understanding to a picture that, even after all of that sustained effort, nobody has ever managed to fully complete. And here's the detail that makes the entire 100-year story feel genuinely bittersweet once you step back and consider it in full. Even after 11 separate excavations, 5 different institutions, and more than a century of patient, dedicated scientific work, the cave itself, the actual physical chamber that Armbruster first noticed exposed in that blasted railway cut back in 1912, is almost entirely gone today. The very same railway construction that first accidentally exposed this remarkable deposit. Also, over the following decades of continued work along that same rail corridor, ended up removing nearly all of the connecting chambers and passages that had once wound through the mountain, the same passages predators had used as dens and shelter across hundreds of thousands of years. What survives today exists only as exposed rock, visible along the walls of that same railway cut, a stretch of ground that now sits along a public recreational trail where travelers can pause and look toward the site directly. But there is no cave left to walk into anymore, no chamber remaining for anyone to physically enter and explore the way Gidley once did back in 1912. The physical source of one of the most scientifically significant fossil deposits in the entire eastern United States has, quite literally, been consumed by the same industrial progress that first accidentally revealed it to the world in the first place. Today, very little of the original Cumberland Bone Cave physically exists at all. The connecting chambers and passages that once wound their way through Will's Mountain, the same sheltered spaces that owls and wolves used generation after generation across hundreds of thousands of years, have been almost entirely removed by the ongoing railway construction that first accidentally exposed this deposit back in 1912. What survives today can only be seen as exposed rock along the walls of that same railway cut, visible at the level of the roadbed on the south wall and again near the top of the north wall. The site now sits directly along a public trail, part of the Potomac Heritage National Scenic Trail, running alongside the Great Allegheny Passage. Travelers moving along that trail can genuinely pause and look directly toward the exposed rock face where this entire scientific story began. But there is no cave left standing for anyone to actually walk into anymore. No chamber remaining to explore the way Gidley once did in that very first season of excavation. The physical source of one of the most significant fossil deposits in the eastern United States exists today mostly as an idea, and a scattered collection of specimens sitting in museum drawers, rather than as a physical space anyone can enter and stand inside. And yet, despite that near-total physical loss of the original cave itself, the scientific work on this deposit has never actually stopped. Excavation and ongoing research continue even now, carried out in part by Maryland's Department of Natural Resources, working with whatever fragments of the deposit remain accessible along that exposed rock face. And in recent years, researchers finally compiled more than a century of scattered accumulated data collected across those 11 separate excavations in 5 different institutions into a single comprehensive scholarly volume. An enormous systematic study running well over 300 pages, written by 11 separate co-authors, dedicated directly to John Gidley and to the decades of field crews who worked alongside him. That publication stands as genuine proof that this deposit is still very much an active area of ongoing scientific study, not a closed case quietly gathering dust in an archive somewhere. It is worth being honest here about exactly what still remains unresolved, because pretending otherwise would not do this story justice. The precise mechanisms connecting the different layers of this deposit across such an enormous age range, spanning hundreds of thousands of years of accumulation, are still genuinely debated among the researchers who study this material most closely. Questions remain about exactly how the different chambers related to one another over time, about which specific predator behaviors dominated during which particular stretches of that long accumulation, and about how the surrounding Appalachian climate and landscape shifted and changed across the full span the deposit actually represents. Researchers working directly with this material are explicit and honest about the genuine limits of current understanding. The full picture of Ice Age life across the mid-Appalachian region remains, even now, considerably incomplete, and Cumberland Bone Cave, despite everything already recovered and analyzed across more than a century of dedicated work, still holds real, unanswered questions inside whatever material remains accessible for future study. Think about what that actually means, set against everything this single site has already produced. A cave bear and a saber-toothed cat standing on permanent public display at the Smithsonian. 40 species identified, more than a quarter of them extinct. A corrected age, established only recently, that pushed the entire deposit back more than 3 times further into the past than anyone originally assumed. 11 separate excavations, spanning 5 institutions and more than 100 years of continuous, dedicated scientific attention. And even after all of that, genuine, honest, uncertainty still remains about exactly how the full story actually fits together. A construction crew blasting a path through solid Maryland limestone in 1912, looking for nothing more than a workable route for a railway line, accidentally opened a window into a stretch of deep time that would occupy multiple scientific careers across more than a century, force a fundamental correction to the accepted age of an entire fossil fauna, and still, even now, refuse to offer up every one of its secrets. The mountain that once held that chamber is mostly gone today, but the questions it left behind, sitting quietly in museum drawers and research papers across 5 different institutions, are very much still alive, and researchers are still actively working to answer them. This was never a story that ended with a single triumphant discovery. It is a story about how long it can take science to even ask the right question about something sitting in plain sight. A railway crew clearing rock for a train line accidentally opened a window into a period of American prehistory that took another 100 years and a completely different dating technology to actually measure correctly. The cave bear and the saber-tooth still stand in a Smithsonian display case today, but the mountain that once held them is mostly gone, and the full timeline of what happened inside it across 700,000 years is still being pieced together. Subscribe for the next investigation, and I will see you in the next one.